The cold was a constant companion. It lived in her bones, a dull ache that never truly faded. It clung to the damp stone floors of the pack house, seeping through the thin soles of her shoes and the threadbare knees of her trousers as she scrubbed. Alara gritted her teeth, pushing the stiff, bristled brush against a stubborn stain. Her hands were raw, the skin split and bleeding in a dozen places. Each motion was a fresh wave of fire against the chill. She was used to it. Pain, like the cold, was simply a part of her existence. She was an omega, the lowest of the low in the Frostfang pack. Less than nothing. A ghost that everyone saw but no one acknowledged, except to heap scorn upon her. She was the daughter of traitors, they whispered. Her parents had been cast out for weakness, for a love that defied the pack's rigid laws, and she was the shameful proof of their failure. She kept her head down, her world reduced to the grimy flagstones in front of her. If she was invisible, she was safe. It was a lie, but it was the only shield she had. A shadow fell over her. Alara's shoulders tensed instantly. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The cloying scent of winter rose perfume always announced Lyra's arrival. "Still scrubbing, little rat?" Lyra's voice was sharp and brittle, like ice cracking underfoot. "You missed a spot." Alara didn't respond. She just scrubbed harder, the scraping sound loud in the sudden silence of the great hall. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. A pristine, fur-lined boot nudged her bucket. It tipped, sending a cascade of filthy, freezing water across the stones she had just finished cleaning. The frigid liquid soaked the hem of her trousers, a shocking, biting cold against her skin. "Oops," Lyra said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "How clumsy of me. You'll have to do it all again." Alara squeezed her eyes shut. A hot tear of humiliation traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Don't react. Don't give her the satisfaction. The words were a mantra she had chanted her entire life. She reached for her rag, preparing to sop up the mess. As her fingers trembled, Lyra's boot shot out, stamping hard on her hand. A cry of pain was torn from Alara's throat before she could swallow it. Bones ground together and a sickening, white-hot agony shot up her arm. Lyra laughed, a sound as beautiful and cruel as her face. "Maybe that will teach you to work faster." She turned, her fine cloak swirling around her, and walked away without a backward glance. Alara cradled her crushed hand to her chest, rocking back and forth on the wet, cold stones. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. The pain was immense, but it was the casual, thoughtless cruelty that truly broke her. The complete certainty in Lyra's eyes that she, Alara, did not matter. That her pain was a source of amusement, nothing more. For a moment, she wanted to just lie there and let the cold take her. It would be so easy to simply stop, to let the world fade to black. But then, something else flickered deep inside her, a tiny, stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished. It was a spark of defiance she had inherited from the parents she barely remembered, a refusal to be broken completely. She pushed herself up, her body screaming in protest. With her good hand, she wrung out the rag and began, once more, to clean the floor. The pain was a living thing, but she worked through it, her jaw set. She would not let them win. She would not let them erase her. That night, the wind began to howl. It was the sound of a great beast awakening, a predatory shriek that rattled the window panes and sent drafts snaking through every crack in the old pack house. A blizzard was coming, one of the worst in a decade. The Alpha, Valerius, Lyra's father, ordered everyone to remain indoors. The gates were barred, the hearths stoked high. Alara was huddled in her small alcove near the kitchens, trying to steal a little warmth from the ovens when Lyra found her again. Her face was flushed with excitement, her eyes glittering with malice. "Father requires a special poultice for his old war wound," Lyra announced, her voice carrying over the rising shriek of the wind. "It needs fresh winterthorn root, the kind that only grows on the northern ridge." A cold dread, far worse than the chill of the storm, settled over Alara. The northern ridge was treacherous on the best of days. In a blizzard like this, it was a death sentence. "But the Alpha ordered everyone to stay inside," Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. Lyra smiled, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. "He did, but his needs come first, don't they? Or are you refusing a direct order, Omega?" It wasn't an order from the Alpha. It was a command from Lyra, cloaked in her father's authority. It was murder, plain and simple. Everyone knew it. The kitchen staff who heard fell silent, their eyes fixed on their tasks, refusing to meet her gaze. No one would help her. No one would speak for her. Alara looked at Lyra's triumphant face and knew she had no choice. Refusal meant a swift public punishment. Going meant a slower, private death in the snow. At least out there she would be alone. She nodded, a single, jerky motion. "I'll go." They gave her a thin cloak, worn and patched, and a small sack for the non-existent herbs. The guards at the gate looked at her with pity, then slid the heavy bar aside just enough for her to slip through. The moment she was out, the gate slammed shut behind her, the sound swallowed by the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and driving shards of ice into her exposed skin. It sliced through her flimsy cloak as if it were made of air. The world was a screaming vortex of white. Snow blinded her, plastered her hair to her skull, and numbed her face in seconds. She bent her head and pushed forward, one foot in front of the other. Why was she even trying? The ridge was impossible to reach. This was just a long, cold walk to her grave. Yet, she walked. That stubborn ember inside her flickered, refusing to die, demanding that she fight until the very last moment. She lost all track of time. It could have been minutes or hours. Her body was a block of ice, her thoughts slow and syrupy. The pain in her hand was a distant, frozen ache. She was falling, stumbling, pushing herself back up, driven by pure animal instinct. Then she fell and didn't get up. Her face was pressed into a deep snowdrift. It was soft, quiet. The roaring of the wind seemed to fade. A strange warmth began to spread through her limbs. Sleep. It was so tempting. Just as her eyes drifted shut, a sound cut through the storm's fury. A low, pained growl. It was close. Her survival instincts, honed by years of abuse, screamed at her. Predator. Wounded, but still a predator. She should crawl away, hide. But the sound came again, and this time it was a whine of pure agony. It was a sound she knew intimately, the sound of a creature in its final moments of suffering. It resonated with the part of her that was currently lying in the snow, waiting to die. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Peering through the blinding snow, she saw a break in the trees ahead, a small sheltered clearing, and in the center of it, a splash of darkness against the suffocating white. She crawled forward, her frozen limbs protesting. As she got closer, the dark shape resolved itself. It was a wolf. A wolf larger than any she had ever seen, its fur the color of a moonless night sky. It lay on its side, its massive chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. A dark, viscous liquid stained the snow around it. Blood. So much blood. Fear, sharp and primal, pierced through her cold-induced stupor. This was no ordinary wolf. This was a shifter. A powerful one, judging by its size. But it was dying. Its flank was torn open in a grievous wound, black and sluggish, as if poisoned. Its head lifted weakly, and its eyes met hers. They were not the eyes of a beast. They were intelligent, ancient, and filled with a world of pain. They were the color of molten gold. The sight held her captive. All her fear, all her cold, all her own pain seemed to vanish, replaced by a strange, compelling empathy. She saw her own suffering reflected in those golden depths, the loneliness, the fight against a world that wanted you dead. Without thinking, she moved closer. Her mind screamed at her to run, that this was madness, but her feet carried her forward until she was kneeling in the blood-soaked snow beside the great wolf. "You're hurt," she whispered, the words stolen and whipped away by the wind. The wolf huffed a weak breath, its golden eyes never leaving hers. It didn't growl. It didn't snarl. It just watched her, a flicker of something unreadable in its gaze. Surprise? Disbelief? She reached out a trembling hand, her instincts screaming. What was she doing? But she couldn't stop herself. She looked at the tattered edge of her own worthless cloak. It was not much, but it was all she had. With clumsy, numb fingers, she tore a long strip from the hem. It was a pathetic offering against such a terrible wound, but she had to do something. She couldn't just watch it die. She leaned forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I'm just going to try and stop the bleeding," she murmured, more to herself than to the wolf. The moment her frozen fingers, clutching the scrap of cloth, brushed against the hot, matted fur near the wound, the world exploded. It was not a sound. It was a feeling. A tidal wave of pure energy slammed into her, a force so immense it threw her backward into the snow. Heat, blazing and absolute, flooded every cell in her body, chasing out the life-threatening cold in a single, violent instant. Light erupted behind her eyes, white and gold and silver. She heard a voice in her mind, a deep, resonant rumble like an earthquake. Mine. A searing, unbearable pain erupted on her left wrist. She cried out, clutching it as she writhed in the snow. It felt as if a star had been branded into her skin. The blizzard, the cold, the dying wolf, it all vanished, consumed by the agonizing, brilliant fire racing through her veins. When her vision cleared, the world had changed. The blizzard still raged, but she no longer felt its bite. A strange, humming warmth pulsed from her core, holding the storm at bay. And the wolf was gone. In its place, kneeling where the great beast had been, was a man. He was huge, broad-shouldered and powerful, his body honed into a weapon. Scraps of torn black clothing clung to his frame, revealing skin crisscrossed with scars old and new. His face was harsh, beautiful, and predatory, framed by a mane of black hair dusted with snow. But his eyes were the same. Molten gold, blazing with an impossible light, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that pinned her in place. He was still bleeding, the terrible wound on his side still weeping black blood, but he seemed to take no notice of it. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, a towering figure of raw power and ancient authority. Alara scrambled backward, pure terror overwhelming the strange warmth inside her. He was a shifter, an alpha, by the sheer force of his presence, and she had just touched him. What had she done? What was happening to her? He took a step toward her, then another. His golden gaze dropped to her left hand, which she was still clutching to her chest. With a speed that was impossibly fast, he closed the distance between them. He knelt before her and gently, inexorably, pulled her hand away from her body. He turned her wrist over. There, on her pale, thin skin, was a mark that had not been there moments before. It was a swirling spiral of silver light, intricate as a galaxy, pulsing with a soft, internal luminescence. It was beautiful and terrifying, and it felt like it was a part of her soul. The man's harsh face softened, the predatory lines easing into something akin to reverence, awe. His thumb stroked the edge of the mark, and a jolt of warmth, pleasant this time, shot up her arm. His golden eyes lifted to meet hers again. They were filled with a century of loneliness, a lifetime of searching, and a discovery so profound it shook the very air around them. You, he breathed, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her chest. It was the same voice she had heard in her head. You're her. Alara could only stare, her mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. Her body, however, had a different reaction. It wasn't afraid. It was drawn to him, to the heat and power radiating from him. It recognized him. A strange, treacherous part of her wanted to lean into his touch, to seek shelter in his strength. It felt like coming home. Who was he? What was this mark? What did he mean, you're her? He saw the terror in her eyes, the confusion warring with the instinctual pull she was so clearly fighting. Do not be afraid, he said, his voice softening, though it lost none of its absolute authority. He was still holding her wrist, his grip gentle but unbreakable. I have you. He swayed again, a wave of dizziness washing over him. The poison in his wound was potent. His golden eyes dimmed for a moment. He needed shelter. You're hurt, Alara said again, the words coming out as a shocked whisper. Her fear for him was suddenly sharper than her fear of him. He gave a grim nod. An ambush. Cowards who strike from the shadows. His eyes burned with cold fury. They will pay. She looked around frantically at the raging blizzard. He would die out here, alpha or not. That ancient, stubborn spark of survival in her, the one that had kept her alive through years of abuse, now flared up for him. There's a cave, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Not far. I used to hide there. It's small, but it's sheltered from the wind. His gaze was heavy, searching. He was the Alpha King, a being of immense power, and yet here he was, wounded and relying on a slip of a girl in a threadbare cloak. But the mark on her wrist was the truth. The bond thrumming between them was the truth. He had found her. Lead the way, he commanded softly. She helped him stand, her small frame straining under his weight. The moment she was pressed against his side, the warmth radiating from her intensified, and she felt it pushing back against the poison that afflicted him. He grunted, a sound of surprise and relief, and his arm tightened around her. She led him through the blinding snow, her steps now sure and certain. The cave was a small fissure in a rock face, almost completely hidden by snowdrifts. Inside, it was tight and dark, but it was blessedly still. The roar of the blizzard became a distant howl. He collapsed onto the dry floor, leaning his back against the stone wall, his breathing harsh. Alara immediately began bustling, her fear replaced by a desperate need to act. She used the hem of her tunic to wipe the snow from his face and hair. She looked at the ugly, black-edged wound on his side. "That needs to be cleaned," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He caught her hand, his golden eyes intense. "My name is Kale." Alara froze. Kale, the supreme alpha, the king of all packs, a figure of legend so powerful and ancient he was more myth than man. And he was her... what? What was this connection between them? "Alara," she whispered, her own name sounding fragile and insignificant. "Alara," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound like a prayer. "I have been searching for you for a very long time." Before she could process this, he released her hand and gestured to the wound. The blade was coated with shadowthorn. It fights the healing. She knew of shadowthorn, a vile poison used by rogues and outcasts. It turned a shifter's healing abilities against them, causing rot and decay. Hesitantly, she placed her hand, the one without the glowing mark, near the wound. She had no healing skills, no knowledge of herbs or medicine beyond what she'd overheard in the kitchens, but she had to do something. She closed her eyes and focused, wishing with all her might that she could take his pain away. A faint warmth trickled from her palm. It wasn't the explosive heat of the bonding, but a gentle, steady glow. Kale gasped, his body going rigid. She snatched her hand back, terrified she had hurt him further. "No," he rasped, grabbing her hand and pressing it firmly back against his skin, near the wound. "Don't stop." Under her palm, she could feel the faint warmth growing stronger, flowing from her into him. She watched, wide-eyed, as the black, necrotic edges of the wound began to recede. The sluggish, dark blood thinned, turning a healthier red. The raw flesh began to knit itself together at a visible, supernatural rate. What was happening? What was she doing? She was no one. A worthless Omega. She had no powers. Kale's golden eyes were fixed on her face, filled with an expression of profound wonder. "A soul healer," he murmured. "Of course. Light to my dark." He let out a long breath, and for the first time, the lines of pain on his face truly began to ease. He was still weak, but the poison was being purged. He kept her hand pressed to his side, his thumb stroking the back of it. He did not let her go for the rest of the night. He asked her questions, his voice low and compelling, about her pack, about her life. She found herself telling him everything. The whispers, the scorn, Lyra's cruelty, the constant, gnawing loneliness. He listened in absolute silence, but with every word she spoke, the air in the cave grew colder, his stillness more dangerous. By the time she finished, his eyes were no longer molten gold. They were chips of hard, cold silver, burning with a rage so profound it was terrifying to behold. "They will suffer for every tear you have shed," he vowed, his voice a low growl of promise. "For every moment of pain. I swear it on my soul." As dawn approached, the blizzard began to break. Kale was stronger, the wound on his side now little more than a fresh scar. He knew he had to leave. His enemies, the ones who had ambushed him, were part of a larger threat, the Ember Covenant. He had to rally his guard and hunt them down. "I must go," he said, his voice laced with regret. He stood, towering over her in the small cave. "But I will be back for you. Soon." Panic seized her. "Don't leave me here!" The thought of returning to the pack house, to Lyra, was unbearable now that she had tasted something else. He knelt before her, framing her face with his large, warm hands. "They will not harm you again, but I need you to be strong for a little while longer. Go back. Hide the mark. Act as you always have. Do not let them see what you are to me." His eyes were intense. "It is for your safety. My enemies are cunning. I will not risk them finding you before I can secure you." He leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but a brand of ownership, a promise. "You are mine, Alara. No matter what happens, hold on to that. I am coming for you." And then he was gone, melting into the gray morning light, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence. The only proof he had ever been there was the silver spiral glowing softly on her wrist and the lingering warmth deep in her soul. Returning to the Frostfang pack house was one of the hardest things Alara had ever done. She pulled the sleeve of her tunic down, hiding the mark, and slipped back in through a service entrance, her heart a cold stone of dread in her chest. She expected to be interrogated, to be punished for her miraculous survival, but strangely, no one said a word. They simply stared at her as she passed, a mixture of shock and suspicion in their eyes. Lyra found her by the hearth, trying to warm her still-chilled bones. She stalked toward her, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You're alive," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "How?" Alara kept her eyes on the flames, her body rigid. "I found a cave." Lyra didn't believe her. Her eyes narrowed, scanning Alara from head to toe, searching for the trick. "You're lying. No one survives a night on the ridge in a storm like that." What really happened? Before Alara could answer, Lyra's gaze snagged on her wrist, where her sleeve had ridden up just a fraction. A faint silver light pulsed beneath the thin fabric. With a snarl, Lyra lunged, grabbing her arm. She shoved the sleeve up, revealing the soul bond mark in its full, luminous glory. For a moment, Lyra just stared, her face draining of all color. Then, her expression twisted into something ugly, a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated jealousy and rage. "What is this?" she shrieked, her grip tightening like a vice. "What have you done?" She knew what it was. Every shifter in every pack knew the legends of the Alpha King and his fated mate, of the soul bond that would mark her when he found her. But for it to be Alara, the worthless, filthy Omega, it was impossible. It was an abomination. "It's nothing," Alara gasped, trying to pull her arm away, but Lyra's grip was iron. "Nothing?" Lyra's laugh was a hysterical, broken sound. She began to drag Alara from the hall. "We'll see what my father has to say about this!" She hauled Alara through the corridors and burst into Alpha Valerius's private study. He was a large, imposing man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, so like his daughter. He looked up, annoyed at the intrusion. "Father, look!" Lyra shoved Alara forward, holding up her arm for him to see the mark. "The Omega! She bears the mark of the king's mate!" Valerius's eyes widened. He rose from his chair, his gaze fixed on the glowing spiral. He was not shocked or outraged. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator that had just seen its prey walk into a trap. "Well, well," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "What an unexpected gift." He had been secretly allied with Moro and the Ember Covenant for years, chafing under Kale's rule, dreaming of a day when he could rise higher. He had been promised power and territory for his aid, and now the king's one weakness had fallen directly into his lap. "Seize her," Valerius commanded the guard standing by the door. Chain her. Alara's blood ran cold. No! She cried, struggling against Lyra's grip. She looked at the faces around her, Lyra's triumphant sneer, Valerius's cold ambition, the guards' impassive obedience. There was no help here. There never had been. The guards grabbed her, their hands rough. One of them snapped a heavy iron cuff around her wrist, right over the mark. But then Valerius held up a hand. "Not iron," he said, his smile widening. "Silver. The legends say it dampens the connection. We wouldn't want the king to find his little pet too quickly, would we?" One of the guards returned with chains of gleaming silver. The moment the cold metal touched Alara's skin, she screamed. It was a pain beyond anything she had ever felt. It didn't just burn her flesh, it felt like it was scorching her soul. The bond, the beautiful, warm connection to Chaol, was suddenly choked, stretched into a thin, agonizing thread of pure agony. The light of her mark flickered and died, smothered under the corrosive touch of the silver. Through the haze of pain, she felt a distant, psychic roar of fury and agony. Chaol. He had felt it. He knew. Valerius laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Excellent. Contact Lord Morrow. Tell him the key to his victory is ready for delivery." They dragged her to the dungeons, her cries echoing in the cold stone halls. The hope that had bloomed in her heart for one short, brilliant night was brutally ripped out, leaving only the familiar, gaping wound of despair. Chaol had told her he was coming, but she knew, with a certainty that shattered her soul, that he would be too late. The journey was a blur of pain and fear. She was bound in silver, gagged, and thrown into the back of a cart like a sack of grain. The constant, gnawing agony from the silver chains was matched only by the torment in her soul. The bond was a screaming nerve ending, a constant broadcast of pain, both hers and Chaol's. It was a shared torture, a weapon being used against them both. Her captors were not Frostfang wolves. They were grim, silent figures cloaked in black, their faces hidden by shadows. They smelled of ash and burnt magic. The Ember Covenant. They took her far from the snow-covered lands of her home, traveling south into a blighted volcanic wasteland. The fortress was a spike of black rock jutting from a desolate landscape, wreathed in smoke and the foul stench of sulfur. It was a place of darkness, a monument to despair. They dragged her through obsidian gates and down into the bowels of the stronghold, finally throwing her into a cold, damp cell. They removed the gag, but left the silver chains on. They clung to her skin, ice and fire, a constant, soul-deep agony. The connection to Chaol was now so faint it was barely a whisper, a distant echo of shared torment. She was truly alone. Hours or days might have passed. Time had no meaning in the darkness. Then, the cell door scraped open and a man stepped inside, flanked by 2 guards. He was tall and unnervingly handsome, with silver hair that seemed to drink the light and eyes the color of dying embers. He moved with a liquid grace, a predator in his prime. He smiled, but it held no warmth. It was the cold, sharp smile of a serpent. "So, you are the one," he said, his voice smooth and hypnotic. He circled her, his gaze analytical, as if studying a particularly interesting specimen. "The great king's hidden weakness. I must admit, I am disappointed. I expected more." This was Morrow, the Shadow King, the leader of the Ember Covenant, the man who had wounded Chaol. "What do you want with me?" Alara asked, her voice a raw croak. Morrow stopped in front of her, crouching down so their eyes were level. With you? Very little. It is the bond you carry that interests me. A connection forged by destiny, they say. A pathetic little fairy tale. True power is not given, it is taken. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw with a single cold finger. She flinched away. Soon the moon will eclipse the sun, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A moment of profound magical flux. At the apex of the eclipse, I will perform a ritual. I will sever your little bond. The psychic backlash will shatter Kale's soul, leaving his mind a ruin. He will be a king in body only, a drooling imbecile on a throne. And I will take what is rightfully mine. He smiled again. And as a bonus, the power of a soul healer, once untethered, will be mine to claim. Your light will feed my shadows. A perfect symmetry. The sheer, monstrous arrogance of his plan stole her breath. He would not just kill Kale, he would unmake him. He would violate her very soul and use her power to fuel his darkness. Despair, absolute and crushing, washed over her. She slumped against the wall, the weight of the silver chains pulling her down. It was hopeless. She was trapped. Kale was coming, but he was walking into a trap that would destroy him utterly. It was all her fault. If he had never found her, he would be safe. Tears of helpless fury and grief burned her eyes. She was worthless. Morrow was right. She was just a weakness, a liability, a tool to be used and discarded. The cell door slammed shut, plunging her back into darkness. She lay on the cold floor, the silver eating at her skin, the silence pressing in. The bond was a razor-thin wire of shared agony. She was fading. He was in agony. They were both dying, separated by miles but linked in their torment. No. The word was a flicker in the abyss of her despair. That stubborn little ember. It was almost extinguished, but it was not gone. You are mine, Kale had said. Hold on. She closed her eyes, shutting out the cell, the chains, the pain. She focused on the thin, agonizing thread of the bond. It hurt. It was like gripping a blade with her bare hands, but she held on. She poured all of her will, all of her desperate, terrified love for the man she barely knew, into that single point of connection. She called his name in her mind, not as a cry for help, but as a statement, a lighthouse in the storm. Kale. She pushed and pushed, ignoring the pain, focusing everything she was into that one word, Kale. For a long time there was nothing but the screaming echo of her own pain. She was about to give up, to let the darkness take her, when she felt it. A response. It was faint, distant, but it was there. A wave of warmth that pushed back against the silver's chill. A surge of raw, untamed fury that was not her own. And then, a voice, clear and strong in her mind, cutting through the agony. Alara. Relief so profound it was painful crashed over her. She sobbed, her body shaking. Hold on, the voice commanded, a promise of violent retribution. I know where you are. I am coming for you. Mine. The connection faded, but it left something behind. Hope. It was a fragile, terrifying thing, but it was real. He was coming. She just had to hold on. The day of the eclipse arrived. The air in the fortress grew thick and heavy, charged with a malevolent energy. Guards came for her, hauling her from the cell. They dragged her up winding stairs to the very pinnacle of the Black Fortress. It was an open-air platform, exposed to the sickly gray sky. The sun was a bruised crescent, slowly being devoured by the shadow of the moon. In the center of the platform stood an altar of polished obsidian, carved with writhing, grotesque runes. Morrow was waiting for her, dressed in ceremonial robes of black and red. He was holding a ritual dagger, its blade forged from shimmering, dark energy. He smiled his serpent smile as she was dragged forward. "The moment is almost upon us," he said, his voice ringing with triumph. "Soon, the age of Kale will be over, and the age of the Ember Covenant will begin." The guards forced her onto the altar, her back pressed against the freezing cold stone. They stretched her arms out, chaining her silver-bound wrists to obsidian posts. She was completely helpless, a sacrifice waiting for the blade. The sky darkened further. The world was plunged into an eerie twilight. Morrow raised his dagger, its dark energy pulsing in time with the dying light. He began to chant in a guttural, ancient language, the words twisting the air around them. The bond, already stretched to its breaking point, began to fray. Alara cried out as a new, tearing pain ripped through her soul. She could feel Kale's panic, his rage, his desperate proximity. He was close, so close. But he was going to be too late. "It is done!" Morrow shouted, his voice ecstatic as the last sliver of the sun vanished behind the moon. Total darkness fell. He lifted the dagger high, preparing for the final, severing blow. At that exact moment, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a cataclysmic impact. The outer wall of the platform disintegrated, blasted inward by a force of pure kinetic rage. Stone and dust flew everywhere. Through the newly created opening, silhouetted against the corona of the eclipsed sun, stood a figure of terrible majesty. It was Kale. He was no longer the wounded man from the cave. He was the Alpha King in his full, terrifying glory. His eyes were not gold or silver, but blazing white-hot furnaces of pure power. Behind him, his royal guard, massive shifters in their hybrid man-wolf forms, poured onto the platform, their howls a symphony of death. The battle was instant and brutal. Kale's guards clashed with Morrow's Covenant mages in a storm of claw, steel, and magic. But Kale had eyes only for the altar, for Alara, for the man standing over her with a cursed blade. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the fortress, he launched himself across the platform. He moved like a blur, a whirlwind of righteous fury. Morrow, shocked for only a second, met his charge. Shadow and light clashed. Kale was physically stronger, his rage giving him immense power, but Morrow was a master of dark magic. He wove spells of shadow and fire, forcing Kale back. Cursed bolts of black energy filled the air. Kale fought like a cornered god, his claws tearing through shadows, his teeth snapping at phantoms. He was closing the distance to the altar, to her. Morrow saw it. With a snarl, he feigned an attack, then spun, throwing the ritual dagger not at Kale, but at Alara. Time seemed to slow. The dagger flew through the air, a streak of darkness aimed directly at her heart. Kale roared her name and threw himself in its path. He twisted his body, taking the blade in his shoulder instead of his chest. He cried out, a sound of pure agony, and stumbled to one knee. The dagger dissolved into black smoke, but the damage was done. A wound of pure shadow magic spread from his shoulder, darkness spiderwebbing across his skin, dimming the light in his eyes. He fought to rise, but the potent magic was overwhelming him. Seeing him fall, seeing him sacrifice himself for her, something inside Alara broke. It was not a gentle crack. It was the shattering of a dam. All the pain, all the fear, all the years of being told she was worthless, It all combined with the fierce, protective, all-consuming love she felt for the man kneeling before her. And it ignited. A soundless scream tore from her soul. A wave of light so pure and so brilliant it was blinding erupted from her body. It was not the gentle warmth from the cave. This was the raw, untamed power of a supernova. The light slammed into everything on the platform. Moro's shadow creatures dissolved into ash. His mages cried out as their dark magic was annihilated. The silver chains on Alara's wrists didn't just melt. They vaporized into harmless steam. The obsidian altar cracked down the middle. Moro was thrown backward, tumbling across the stone floor, his robes smoking, his skin blistered by the pure, holy light. Alara sat up, unbound. The light was still pouring from her, a halo of white gold fire. She scrambled off the broken altar and rushed to Kale's side. He was slumped forward, the shadow magic consuming him, his golden eyes dimming to a faint flicker. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with a power she had never known. "You will not take him from me." She placed her hands on his wound. She didn't ask or wish for healing. She commanded it. The light flowed from her palms into his body, a torrent of life and warmth. It met the spreading darkness and obliterated it. The shadow magic hissed and recoiled, burned away by a power it could not comprehend. Kale's wound vanished. The light in his eyes flared back to life, brighter than ever. He stared at her, his expression one of stunned, absolute awe. Alara stood, turning to face Moro, who was struggling to his feet. She was no longer the frightened Omega. Her body was thrumming with power, her eyes glowing with the same white gold light that surrounded her. "You called me worthless," she said, and her voice did not tremble. It rang across the platform, clear and absolute, the voice of a queen. "You called me a weakness." Moro stared at her, his serpentine confidence shattered, replaced by disbelief and fear. What are you?" "I am his," she declared, her voice resonating with the power of the bond, now a roaring, triumphant river of energy between her and Kale. "And he is mine." She raised her hand. Chains of pure, solid light erupted from the stone floor, wrapping around Moro, binding him completely. They did not burn him. They simply held him, inert and powerless, his darkness utterly negated by her light. "You were wrong," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, final whisper. The battle was over. Silence descended on the broken platform. The eclipse was ending, and the first rays of the returning sun crested the horizon, bathing the scene in a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from Alara herself. Kale rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. The awe was still there, but it was mingled with a love so profound, so absolute, it was a physical force. He stopped just before her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face as if seeing her for the first time. "My queen," he breathed, the words of vow, a prayer, and coronation. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he cupped her cheek. His touch was exquisitely gentle. All the terror and pain of the last few days dissolved under that simple, reverent gesture. She leaned into his palm, a shudder of pure relief racking her body. Then he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. It was not a gentle embrace. It was the desperate, possessive hold of a man who had almost lost everything. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent as if it were air itself. "I had you," he murmured against her skin. I had you, and I almost lost you. You found me, she whispered back, her arms wrapping around his massive frame, holding on just as tightly. You always find me. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his golden eyes blazing. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not like the chaste kiss on the forehead in the cave. This was a kiss of fire and claiming, of desperation and homecoming. It was the culmination of a centuries-long search and the beginning of an eternal future. All the pain of the severed bond, all the agony of their separation was burned away in that single, soul-deep connection. As their lips met, the world around them seemed to fade away. The bond, already a roaring river, became a raging supernova. A blinding light enveloped them both. Alara felt a searing heat not on her wrist this time, but on Cale's skin, right where her hand rested over his heart. When the light subsided, they pulled apart, breathless. Alara looked at her wrist. The silver spiral was brighter than ever, a permanent shining constellation on her skin. Cale took her hand and placed it on his chest. There, burned into his skin directly over his heart, was a matching silver spiral, glowing with the same inner light. The bond was complete, solidified. Not just his claim on her, but her claim on him. They were two halves of a single soul, visibly and irrevocably linked for all eternity. He looked down at the mark on his chest, then back at her, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. The surviving members of his royal guard had dealt with Moro's remaining forces. They now stood in a respectful circle, their heads bowed, their expressions a mixture of reverence and awe for the queen who had saved their king. They returned not to the cold lands of the Frostfang Pack, but to the heart of Cale's kingdom, the Sunstone Citadel. It was a place carved from living rock and ancient trees, warmed by an eternal spring, a bastion of life and strength. It was the complete opposite of the cold, oppressive world she had always known. As they entered the grand hall, the waiting pack members and alphas from across the territories fell silent, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of their king and the small, slender woman at his side. They saw the matching marks glowing on their skin. They felt the sheer power of the completed bond radiating from them. Cale led her to the dais where two thrones sat, one of dark, polished ironwood, his own, and one beside it, smaller, of pale silver birch that had sat empty for centuries. He turned to face the assembled crowd, his arm firmly around Alara's waist. For centuries our people have awaited the coming of their true Luna Queen. His voice boomed, filled with pride and power. Today, that waiting is over. He gestured to Alara. This is Alara, my soulmate, your queen. She is a soul healer whose light saved your king and banished a great darkness. She is the other half of my soul. Her word is my word. Her command is my command. He took a simple circlet of silver and moonstones from an attendant and gently placed it on her head. It settled into her hair as if it had been made for her. It was not heavy. It felt right. Alara looked out at the sea of faces. They were not staring at her with scorn or pity. They were looking at her with respect, with reverence, with hope. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. She was seen, truly seen. She looked up at Cale, at the endless, unconditional love in his golden eyes. The last vestiges of the cold, worthless Omega from the Frostfang Pack melted away, leaving behind a woman who had found her power, her purpose, and her place. She was no longer Alara the outcast. She was Alara, the Luna Queen. She was a warrior, a healer. She was home, and she was loved forever.